All right, thank you for having me. This paper is not about maps. It's about map makers and map making at a specific time. I'm talking today about women map makers of the Army Map Service during World War II. I'm talking about how they were trained, what they did, and how they lived during a very unusual time. On December 17, 1941, 10 days after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed a bill allocating funds for the defense effort. It included funds for mapping in areas that the Army considered strategic. At the start of the war, the American mapping supply was inadequate. In fact, one Army officer was quoted as saying, "We weren't caught with our pants down. We had no pants." In many cases, especially in the Pacific, the maps that were available were from the 19th century. And so the Army Map Service was formed and given this mission. It became apparent very early on that there weren't enough men to carry out this job. At the start of the war, there were only 100 civilian employees in the Army Map Service. This wasn't nearly large enough to produce the millions of maps needed. In addition, the draft took many of those men. Various solutions were tried, including hiring local high school students to help draft the maps. But the most successful was establishing map-making classes at universities aimed at women students. The government, under the United States Office of Education, had established the ESMWT program, the Engineering Science Management War Training Program, at colleges to help train students in engineering and science. And as a part of that, the military map-making program was begun and focused on women. The MMM, or 3M program, as it was called, was directed by Edith Putnam Parker of the University of Chicago Geography Department. Parker was in charge of selecting colleges and instructors for their program and for designing the course materials. Ultimately, 22 colleges were involved. They were largely women's colleges and some co-ed. They were in the East and the Midwest. There were no colleges in the West. Although I've not yet been able to find and identify all of the instructors, those I have found were women, included Alice Mary Dowes at Wellesley, Eleanor Hanlon at Syracuse University, Ruth Schmidt, who was a student of Armin Lobeck's at Columbia, and Edna Eisen, a student of Parker's at Kent State University in Ohio. None of these universities, with the exception of Chicago and Columbia, taught cartography prior to the war. At that time, cartography was considered a mere tool of geography and geology, not a discipline. In addition, there were no American textbooks in cartography other than Irwin Royce's General Cartography, which was first published in 1938. There were some military field manuals on map reading and map drawing. But during the war, because of interest in maps, some new books, primarily on map reading, were published. And I have a couple of examples here. Roderick Petty's Military Map Reading, that was published in 1942, and Armin K. Lobeck's Military Maps and Their Photographs, Their Use and Interpretation, in 1944. And then there was David Greenwood's Down to Earth Mapping for Everybody in 1944. In 1942, Virginia Dunmeyer, here on the left, Mary Ellen Neal, and B. Shaheen on the right were among the women who completed the new military map-making classes at Kent State University in Ohio. And here we have Mary Ellen. All three were elementary education majors, although B and Virginia both had minors in geography. They were invited by Edna Eisen, the instructor of the class, to attend a meeting about the class, and all signed up. Miss Eisen often handpicked students. Noting women who did well in other classes, she would suggest taking the 3M class. Girls were told at the end of the class they would be eligible for jobs at the Army Map Service. The 3M class, which included map drawing and air photo interpretation, was a 60-hour class, not for credit, but passing it successfully basically guaranteed a job with the Army Map Service that paid well, $1,260 to $1,620 a year, which was considered a good salary. The campus newspaper noted picnics and other events that were held for the students, presumably to build camaraderie. Although the class ended before the end of the semester and they were accepted to AMS, all three of these women elected to delay their move to Washington until after graduation. They were among the 200 women who were of the first group of military mapping maidens. The women were called the military mapping maidens, or the 3M girls, but B. Shaheen says they weren't offended by this term, and in fact, they considered it cute. It gave them an identity. At this time, they were also frequently referred to as girls, but this wasn't intended to belittle them. Soldiers were frequently referred to as our boys. In the context of the time, it wasn't considered offensive. On arriving at AMS, the women were given a 4-week in-service training program before being assigned to a task in order to determine for what jobs they were best suited. They worked 70-hour weeks and there were 2-hour shifts. At that time, the service had established a production line method for making maps, and each employee had a specific task. No one created a map from start to finish. The jobs included compilation, photo interpreter, drafter, printmaker, editor, and librarian. This is the drafting room. The drafting work was pen and ink, and lettering was printed on adhesive strips and stuck on, which replaced tedious hand lettering. Each map required about 600 hours of work. B. Shaheen was initially a drafter, and the things that were made were topographic maps, silk escape maps, and relief models. The women created maps for D-Day and for other significant events, and often didn't know what the maps would be used for, only that it was important and it had to be done fast. Librarians kept track of source materials, older maps, travel brochures, anything that would help. Photo interpretation was very important during the war. On-ground surveying was not possible in many, perhaps most cases, so the sources for maps were old maps and new photographs flown for mapping. Virginia Dunmeyer and Mary Ellen Neal were both assigned to photo interpretation. Originally, the facility where the map makers worked was the Engineer Reproduction Plant, which was located at Fort McNair in the Washington, D.C. area, and was established in World War I. A new facility, the Ruth Building, was built in Brookmount, Maryland. It was highly camouflaged. Irwin Royce, in his 1948 edition of General Cartography, described the building as having no windows and so effectively camouflaged that there was little suggestion outside of the spacious drafting rooms, map collections, and engraving and printing establishments inside. The numbers of maps that were prepared and shipped were mind-boggling. This slide shows the numbers and the sharp draft after the war. We could see that in 1945, before the war ended, 172 million plus copies of maps were shipped. And then a precipitous drop to 46 million in 1946. These numbers are mind-boggling. Each year, there were 9,000 maps prepared for shipment. At the end of the war, 47%, or 847 women of the AMS employees at the base plant were women, and the overall percentage for the Army Map Service was 58%, or 178 women working at all of the different plants. There were 200 women, as I said, in the first class of Millies, and although there were other facilities, most went to Washington, D.C. Other agencies were also employing women and men in large numbers for a variety of wartime jobs, which presented a problem for the city and for the government. Most of these women were young. They were fresh out of college, in their early 20s. Where would they live? What would they do in downtime? How to keep up morale? Government planners looked into constructing temporary housing in the city. The largest of these was Arlington Farms, and we have an air photo of it here. We could see the Pentagon and the Potomac River. It was sometimes called Girl Town, or described as, what I have here, 28 acres of girls. It was built near Arlington Cemetery, which was about 7 miles from the map service headquarters. This facility had furnished apartments for the women to live in. They had laundry facilities, maid services, a game room, a service store, and a parlor. And here we have a couple of the women standing in front of the residence halls, waiting for the bus to take them to work. The lounge or parlor, as they called it, is shown here. And we can see that the soldiers were very fond of the 28 acres of girls. They had dances, there were softball games and so forth. This is one of the softball teams. B was on one called the Contours, how appropriate. And the recreation, boating on the Potomac. This is Virginia and Mary Ellen. Another facility was McLean Gardens, which in 1942 was built on the McLean estate and consisted of dormitory-style housing for both male and female workers. The mansion that had been built at the McLean estate was torn down, and this shows the dorms under construction. Despite these facilities, not all of the women chose to live in Girl Town or McLean Gardens. Many chose to rent apartments, often in attics and basements. Now, B. Shaheen lived in McLean Gardens, but Virginia Dunmeyer and Mary Ellen Maarel, who had been friends since second grade, opted for an attic apartment on the third floor of a private house. At the end of the war, many men, returned to their previous AMS jobs, and many women went back to their original plans, but not all of the women left the AMS. Virginia Dunmeyer decided to remain with the agency until her retirement in 1972. She married a man who had returned from the Army and who also worked for the AMS. Mary Ellen Maarel married a man who had worked for the AMS, and she remained until 1950 when her son was born. B. Shaheen returned to Ohio and became a teacher and married a lawyer. However, she remained in contact with other women at AMS. She arranged reunions in Washington for the 25th anniversary and also for the American Bicentennial in 1976. In 2016, over 70 years after the end of the war, the military mapping maidens were finally recognized by being selected for induction into the Geospatial Intelligence Hall of Fame. And B was chosen to accept the honor on behalf of all of the women. B will turn 100 in December of this year. And she's been very helpful to me. We've exchanged emails and talked on FaceTime. She has said many times, I never expected to be a pioneer, but I believe the military maidens were truly pioneers. Thank you.